All right, well, welcome. Today we'll be talking about metrics, meaningful metrics, but in particular about how we are going to have those connected into this whole idea of going back to the office. So just to kind of point out where we are, Roxanne and I have been doing these webinars now since the beginning of the year. And we've got this pattern going now where the first one we do, which is the second week of the month, is about change analytics. So that's where we are now. And the second one, which is the fourth week, is about change leadership. And so you can see the kind of pattern that we're in here. But because this idea of coming back to the office has become pretty hot, we are changing the one that we would normally do at the end of this month and making it about decision making. So making it about the decision to go back to the office, which we'll actually touch on just a bit in today's, but we want to go into that in significantly more depth. So in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about that. So if you have interest in jumping into that one, please check out our website and register for that. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, today we are going to talk about these three things. So we'll start off with the value of change analytics and just, what is it and what do we get out of it? And then we'll talk about insight and how do we get more insight from change analytics, and then into this idea finally around values-based decision-making. And all of that we're going to wrap around the idea of going back to the office. And we have some examples in here, some metrics examples, as well as a little bit of a scenario, just to give you guys something to wrap onto as we go through all of this. So let's talk about change analytics and what are we really trying to get to here, and how do we overcome what might be some objections that can come up from skeptics. So why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it so that we know if we're getting anywhere. So is this thing working for us or not? And we're going to put some metrics around this so that we know. And it really is coming back to this idea of it's very difficult to manage it if you can't measure it. And so we want to have some metrics that we can put in place so that we're able to really understand what is going on with the effort. In this case, the effort to go back to the office. So what are some of the things that skeptics come up with, and what would be some reasonable responses to that? So the first is, well, it's too inexact. And as an analyst, I would tell you that you do not need that, right? You need to get a directional view about what's going on. Being precise isn't helping that much. It's lovely to be able to get there, but if you know directionally if you're on the right track or not, then you can make some smart moves just based off of that. The next is that it's too subjective, and again, we would disagree that the subjective measures, how do people feel about things, is actually important, and we're explicitly going to try and pull that into the work that we're doing here, because that gives us information that we wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Again, you can hear skeptics talk about being too qualitative, and we would include qualitative measures as well. Quantitative is great, but it's by itself is not as useful as getting qualitative measures in there. And then finally, it's just too difficult. And we would agree that you can certainly go overboard on metrics and spend time and, as a result, money, energy on doing it, and you don't necessarily need to go that far. So we do want to scale the effort to be appropriate to the value that we're going to get. So that is a reasonable thing to highlight, but certainly, in our view, manageable. We can come up with a good way to pull all that together. So I want to share this map of mathematics with you, not to scare you off, but because I think it's kind of fun to see it in a little bit more of a graphical format. So we're going to be playing in the upper right corner, right? The left-hand purple side is pure mathematics, which is interesting but not useful for the chain. The blue side is the application side. And that's really what we're doing. And we're going to come up with some applied measures here. And I want to give you just a little bit of a framework to think about it, of this sort of hierarchy of going from descriptive analytics to predictive analytics, so your guess for the future, to prescriptive analytics. So exactly what should I do in order to get the right answer? And what some examples that we would think about are around descriptive are probability and statistics, and even just visualizing, or creating a graph is a way to do descriptive. Predictive is going to be a bit more deep. So now you're getting into things like regression and simulation and behavioral economics. Now we're trying to predict what are people going to go do. And then prescriptive tends to be even more difficult to execute on, but gives you an exact answer. So when you're doing something around optimization or decision analytics and game theory, those are all examples of things that are really telling you precisely the thing to go do. All right, so
just want to bring your attention, Dennis said that he has reported to the 4th decimal place to engineers and they were impressed.
Yeah, well, I have that engineering background and, we appreciate that kind of precision. So thank you, Dennis, for successfully doing that. Makes all those engineers much more happy.
Yeah.
But what we want to do is we want to go from the 4th decimal point, which is data, and then be able to move that to information. So it's something that we can actually work with. And that's where the analytics part of this is going to come in. And then finally, the knowledge, and that's having now some experience. We're paying attention to the information through the analytics, and we're getting knowledge now about what is going on with the system, which would be how I would think about it. This is really just all the humans, and they're running around doing things and working with the new organization, and what does that mean? And so that's what we're going to try and do with this approach to get some insight from the analytics. And we're going to use this 3-layered approach in order to go do that. And this gets to what we were talking about just a couple minutes ago about bringing in subjective measures and qualitative measures, as well as quantitative measures, and put them together into a package. And so what we would suggest you look at is first, what are the self-reported metrics? So what are the people themselves actually saying about what is going on with the change and the progress that's being made? And this is in the realm that most change managers would use in terms of putting a survey together and asking people for their feedback. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with various forms of this. But we would add on to that as well observable behaviors. So what do you see? What does a leadership team see? What does perhaps an extended network of change ambassadors or change stakeholders that you might put together? What do they observe about what's going on? And then finally, and this is going to be key, I think, for any business analyst that's out there, any leader that's out there, and showing them that this work that you're doing is really having an impact. And that's looking at the existing metrics of the business and showing that they are moving in the direction you want them to, or at least not moving at all if you're trying to have no impact, if that's your goal, but certainly not moving in a bad direction. And hopefully that ties back to whatever it is that is the impetus to go do this change. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of this go back to the office thing. The main question there is going to be why? Why do you want to go back to the office? What are you hoping to get out of that? So we want to get to those more quantitative measures so we can really understand what the impact is to the business as a result of that. All right, so let's jump in and take a look at some of these and kind of see what it means. And we're just going to put together a little scenario here. So we're going to imagine that we have a software development company and they want to go back to the office. They're thinking about going back to the office. And the approach that they want to take is they're essentially going to do a soft opening back to the office over the summer. And what that means is they've announced that the office itself is open. They're not mandating that people go in, but they're inviting them in to go to the office, try it out, get comfortable again with coming back to the office. They've announced an intent to figure out how they're going to use the office in the future, but they have not set a specific date where everyone is going to be back and we're going all the way back to being the way it was before the pandemic. In fact, what they've said is, we don't know, and we're going to try and get smarter about what the right thing to do is as we go through this process of doing the soft opening. But we suspect that being together is good for our culture and potentially good for productivity, helping the actual creation of the software that these folks develop.
So that's the hypothesis.
That's their hypothesis.
Got it.
So as we do the metrics, to Roxanne's point, what she's highlighting here is we need to know what it is that we're trying to figure out. So we're trying to figure out what is the impact of the office on the business. And that's probably too broad, but at least it gets us set up in the right direction and we can start to narrow that down a little bit as we get a bit smarter about what actually happens here. So let's look into these and go through our 3 layers. So first, self-reporting. So you might do something like a survey. And if you've done this sort of change work before, which I know so many of you have, you might ask a question like, I feel ready for the change. And in this case, you might ask, I feel ready for the change for going back to the office. And let's say we did this survey in Q2 and we had 60% of the people say, yeah, I feel ready. And now we've just recently done it here in Q3, and you'll notice that the numbers have gone down to 30% have said yes. So something's up. Maybe we want to pay attention to that. Maybe as it's become more real, people have reevaluated their feelings about what it means to go back to the office. Maybe something else has gone on. This is instructive, and probably other questions will be even further and more instructive, but probably not enough, right? Because we're really just getting a subjective assessment from the people themselves about what's going on, which is valuable, but we want more. So we want to try and add in these other elements in order for this to go well. So we might then step into observable behaviors. And the way in which we like to think about it is across these 4 dimensions. We think about the path that a person takes as they go through a change, what happens. We like to think about them going to engage and then having them understand, then begin to test and learn what is going on with this change, and then finally adopt. So we might look for things like, are people aware of what's changing to actually know, are they in the engage phase? Do they understand how the change impacts them? I mean, they're starting to wrestle with it some. And then are they starting to take action? So what actions are they taking to get their brain wrapped around the change and what it means to them? And then finally, are they really successfully performing the way that you wanted them to in the first place? Have they adopted? So that's kind of the flow that we're looking for. Let me give you some examples in this context, right? So if our example is we want to start using this office again, then you can see across our 4 stages that we're looking for, we might start with something like this. Do you observe that the team members are even reading these messages? So maybe you use Slack, and you might want to check, is anybody actually looking at the Slack messages, or are they even opening the emails that we're sending about this thing? Even at like the very beginning, very basic engagement, is that going on? There could be other things, but that's just an example. For understand, you might look to see, do you actually observe people starting to go back to the office? I mean, is anyone even showing up in this interim period over the summer to try it out? And that would certainly tell you something. If people are going, that tells you one thing, and if they're not going, that tells you something else. Do you, for test and learn, do you observe that the team members are trying different sort of interactions and different meetings? Do they start doing their weekly review meeting in the office, or does the leader of a group start doing the daily stand-up in the office? What's going on? What's actually happening as people are doing it? So what do you observe about what's going on? And then finally, if they're in adoption, do you observe that these team members are using the office with some level of purpose and some level of regularity? So you're paying attention to that. And you might set up a weekly meeting or a regular meeting with the leadership team to ask them to check in on, hey, what do you guys observe? And get that feedback from them about what's happening, and use that as part of this balanced approach. The other would be, in terms of observable, would be, what are you hearing? And that really means questions. And again, our 4 areas from engage to understand, test and learn, and adopt. And we're going to want to look at them across all 4 of those as well, and start to think about what's going on with those. So here again, in the example, we've got our 4 all the way across. So for engage, we might be listening for questions like, when are we doing this? And why do we really need to go back at all? And is this mandatory? And so if you start to hear questions like that, that tells you one thing. When you start to hear questions like, do I have to be there every day? And what if I'm not actually going to interact with anybody? And do I really need to show up to the office? So they're trying to understand. I will tell you just a quick story about this. When in the past, as I've gotten questions like that, as a leader, I've had the emotional reaction of, shut up and go do it. You need to go do those things. And fortunately, I've been schooled by Roxanne that is not a bad thing. This is not questions about pushing back. These are questions about trying to understand how all this works together. And that was not obvious to me. So it is useful. It's just a little side note to have somebody working with you to help you through that, right? That may be you doing it for a leader, or maybe you as a leader getting somebody who is helping to give you a second perspective on what's going on, because it can be hard, or at least it was hard for me, to internalize that in a positive way. I wanted to push back against it. If you're in test and learn, you might be hearing questions like, hey, how can I be part of this? Can I try out some different technologies, or maybe try out a different technique? Any of those kinds of questions. Now people are starting to really wrestle with, well, what does it mean to go back to the office? And what would really happen here? And then finally, you know that you're at the good spot when people are asking you, hey, when's the next happy hour? Because now they're really thinking in terms of being in the office and being part of the group. And you're asking business as usual kind of questions. They've adapted to this idea. So those are just examples. There might be other things that you want to take a look at for any particular situation. But for our software company, these seem appropriate, that they would pay attention to those and culturally in line with how the people within the group would actually think about this. So finally, I want to get to these existing metrics. And we're going to start to wrap our minds around what's going on with the metrics for the business itself. And there are all kinds of things that you might go after. So certainly things like productivity metrics and operational efficiency metrics would be important. But there could be things in there around client satisfaction and employee satisfaction, and all of those can matter as well. And we really suggest looking across the gamut of things that are operational to things that are about your culture. So how do you know if the people within the company are engaged or not engaged, happy or not happy, enjoying the culture or not enjoying the culture? And so having some of those metrics, part of this is going to be important as well, to be able to pull all that together. So for our software company, we might want to do something that is a bit of a scorecard. And so we might look at things like chargeability and code error rate. That's sort of a typical things that a software company that does custom development is going to look at. And maybe our goal is to have 72% chargeability and we're at 75. But our goal is a 5% error rate and we're up to 10. So that starts to tell us something. That coupled with what are we hearing and seeing, and that coupled with what is going on with the surveys that we've got from people might start to tell us a little bit about what's going on, and kind of pull that together into a complete picture. So people are less feeling ready to go back to the office, and at the same time, the code error rate is going up. We might want to explore that and see what is happening with that. Maybe we're looking at things like the applicant acceptance rate, and we want to get a 90% or a higher acceptance rate. So once we actually make an offer, we want people to take it. And so we're tracking what is happening with that through time. And we might be tracking our attrition rate, which we're trying to keep below an annualized 5%, but we notice that it's starting to creep up on us. Pay attention to things like revenue and what's going on with costs. We see costs slightly creeping up, and revenue took a pretty big hit in the previous month. So what's going on with all that? But on the other side, we see that contracts that are out for signature is actually above our threshold of 2 per month. And so maybe we're in good shape there. You'll notice that this company has got the Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote market pretty locked up. So they're pretty heavy in that market area. So we put the scorecard together to be able to get a fuller picture of the business metrics that we actually care about, but we're coupling those together with the other metrics that we have so that we can get to actionable insights. So maybe we're doing surveys and we're carefully timing those at key points along this process. If we do regular feedback pulse checks, then we want to bring those in as well. Maybe we're paying attention to candidates that are coming in applying for the jobs, and what are they talking about in terms of the location? Are they saying that being in an office setting is a non-starter for them? They're really looking for completely remote work. Doesn't make one answer right or wrong, but it's all information to pull in to be able to make a better decision. And ultimately, out of all this, that's what we want. We want to be able to make a decision because we've gotten actionable insights. The action that we want to take is make the decision and then go do something. We're going to add in things like these observable behavior, what's going on with these visits, what are people asking, what are interviewees saying, and then these existing metrics as well, and what's going to be important. And that last one, I just want to touch on that again, is this idea of culture, because a move to an office or going back to reusing an office could have a potentially significant impact on the culture. I'm sure you guys have seen some of these surveys that are out there. There are a bunch of them now, but what we've seen is rates of anywhere from 30% to 50% of every working person in the US is contemplating a job move. That is an amazing number and should be kind of concerning, especially when the time frame around that is by the end of the year. So in the next 6 months, a third to a half of all the people who are working in the US are at least thinking about making a move to a new company. So something is up. It's been dubbed the Great Resignation, which is sort of clever, but it does encapsulate what could potentially be devastating moves for companies if they have any sort of a significant exodus. We're already seeing companies that are struggling to find new people, hires. The market itself has become so competitive. So in this particular case, as we start to contemplate going back to the office, it's not just the operational things that we want to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to the cultural underpinnings of that too, because if people are judging not maybe the move itself, but even just how the move itself is being handled, how that change is being introduced, are they being consulted and engaged in the process would be one of the things that might be very important for how people think about this. This could have a significant impact on your culture. Those, I'm presenting those essentially as all negative, but we could flip it the other way as well and think about how could we make the move back to the office such that it improves our culture. So can we look at things and understand the changes? What behaviors are we starting to see? Does anything stand out? Or do we see any themes in there? Are there risks that we're taking care of, but not so that we can necessarily maintain the status quo, but so that we can actually advance our culture? Could we have a company that's even more engaged, has a higher engagement as a result of starting to use this office, as well as improve all these operational metrics and bring all of those along? The last thing around this we want to make sure that we're paying attention to is that, for sure, we got to start with whatever the goals are, the initiative, which sort of implies that you have to have goals. So that gets back to this why question. When companies are talking about, we're all heading back to the office on a certain date. Well, why? What is your goal for doing that? And we would suggest it needs to be something more interesting than, well, we were there 2 years ago, so we want to go back. Like you need to know what's going on, because I think it's safe to say that we are all altered as a result of the last 18 months or so, that it's just not the same anymore. And company cultures are altered as a result of that too. So before going back to the office, we need to have some goals as to what we're going to achieve as a result of going back to the office. And then against that, we need to actually be able to measure those goals. So we need to define them in a way that are actually measurable. So it has to be something more than, well, it's just good for the culture, or we seem to collaborate better. Okay, fine, but can you measure that collaboration? Can you measure what the impact is to the culture? And what we're suggesting is to think of metrics that do actually tell you that. And this forces you to be a bit more precise in the goals themselves, because you have to articulate them in a way that's going to be useful. But the last thing to keep in mind, that certainly applies here, but we would say in any change, is you got to pay attention to what are the external forces that might be putting pressure to change your goals. So in this case, we have to pay attention to a resurgence of the virus. So what would happen with that? So setting up a change structure that doesn't pay attention to what's going on outside is really more of an exercise in how great are you at predicting things than it is an exercise in how good are you at being able to manage the change. So maybe in this case, a resurgence of the virus is sort of an obvious, hey, we would make a change, but all too often you can see companies that are putting together an initiative around that and just being locked in to the metrics that they put together and go, oh, well, it doesn't matter that we've done this merger, or it doesn't matter there's been an economic change external to the company. We're still holding people accountable. That to us seems foolish. We're not really chasing after something that's going to be useful that way. So the last piece is to kind of wrap all this together into this idea around how do you make the decision. And we're going to talk about a values-based decision process. And in 2 weeks, we'll spend the entire 45 minutes going much more deeply into that. But we want to give you at least a high-level view of what that is right now. And this is based on this idea that Ralph Keeney had put together. And it's essentially the core of his book is basically people make decisions backwards. What they do first is they pick all the alternatives, they discuss those, even argue about those, and then with the thing that they care about, how they're going to evaluate the criteria hidden, they try and come up with a decision, and that's a poor way to do it. So I'm sure all of you have experienced this in various ways, everything from what's going on in your business to where are we going on the family vacation, or even where are we going to go for lunch, and have what people are making their judgment by unknown. And so making that decision can be very hard. So what he says is flip it, make explicit the things that you value. So then you can go move forward to be able to make the decision. And there's certainly much more to it than that, but that's the heart of the idea of how we're going to put all this together. So we like to take this and put it into these 3 steps. So first, we'd suggest that you go about selecting the metrics. That's really what we were talking about before. But now test the impact of those metrics so that you know what you would do if you're at the extremes of what those metrics could be, and then make contingency plans based on those. So we might step through, first determine what we value, brainstorm metrics that can help us measure what we value, and then narrow those down, because you're probably going to come up with way too many. So you want to look at things that are overlapping. And so if you've come up with 3 metrics and they're sort of similar to each other, reduce that down to 1 and kind of go through the process to prune them. And then move to test, where what we would suggest is you're going to look at the high possible value and the low possible value, as well as the most likely. What do you think it's going to be? And then what do you think the distribution of all of that, and given the values that might come up, what would you do about it? And if you look at a metric and go, well, I don't care if it goes to its highest value or its lowest value with this change, then that's probably not a useful metric, because you're measuring it and it might be interesting, but it's not useful because you're not going to take action. So get rid of it. And now once you're down to that core set of metrics, make contingency plans. So what are your actions going to be based on where those metrics might go? And this is referred to often as a pre-mortem. So instead of waiting for the failure to happen and then looking back at it, a post-mortem. In this case, we're going to imagine that a failure has occurred, and what would be the things that might have made it happen, and then how would we know if those are coming? What would the metrics actually look like? And then put together our plans based on that. So that would be the pre-mortem exercise and how we would use these. So if we want to think about this from our example and how that would go with our software firm, we're going to make a values-based decision. We would get all the decision makers together and we would ask them, what do they care about? So the head of the engineering team might say, well, I care about code quality and I care about the interaction of my software engineers. There might be a bunch of other things. The head of sales might say, well, I care about the ability to drive sales, access that I get to the engineers to be able to do that, access that I get to the C-suite to be able to shake hand and glad hand with the customers. And so there are a bunch of things in there that I value. And we would go through that entire process and come up with all the things that they would think of as making the move back to the office a success. And then come up with metrics that would let them know whether or not the thing that they value is moving in a good direction or moving in a bad direction. And then for each of those, we would test the impact. So this is kind of a scenario planning approach. So what's the most likely value? So what's the most likely value for the code error rate? What's the highest value? What's the lowest value? So the error rate's probably not going to 0. So what's the likely low value? The error rate's probably not going to 50%, or if it is, you're in a lot of trouble as a software firm. So what's the most likely value, or what's the highest value? And then what do you think it's most likely to be? What's the distribution that's in there? So I'm looking at this not as a significant analytic exercise, but kind of more of a qualitative one. What's the shape of that distribution? Is it going to be even? Is it more like a bell curve? What do you think it is? Probably mostly going to be a bell curve, but not all the time. just put those basics together, and then think your way through what happens if we have several of these metrics go to their worst level or go to their best level. What would we do with that? What is the thing that might make that happen? And then what mechanism can we put in place to prevent that? And then even with all of that, it still happens. What are we going to go do? So we've worked through all of that while we're here and dispassionate and not in the heat of the moment, don't have to worry about accusatory fingers or any other emotional stuff that might be coming, which happens. And this is a way to avoid that and talk through it beforehand, when you're able to make, a better decision based on an easier understanding of what's going on without all the emotional baggage that's going to go with that. And then if the thing does happen, now it's much easier to take that on. So we would look at all of this as a layered approach, right? So the first part of putting metrics together is really about, are you completing the project or not? And so this is the realm of project managers. And mostly they're going to look at things like scope, schedule, and budget, and are we moving the project forward the way that we want to? So we're going back to the office and we got to spend money to sanitize the office, and we got to spend money to go get things turned back on again and do all of that, which is fine to actually execute. But as you guys know that are engaged in change, that's not enough. We got to get to the next level, which is, do we actually get to the business goal? And for that to happen, people are going to have to be engaged. And so that's what change management is about. How do we engage the people in a way that's going to be useful for the business goal? But, Roxanne and I would urge you to go even further and think about the culture. So in this case, is this move back to the office improving the culture? And if you did it in a certain way, could it improve the culture? So probably slamming everybody back in the office isn't actually going to do anything positive for your culture. You might hope it will, or a leader might think, well, it'll all be better once we're there, but it'll be rough as you go through that transition. So how you do it matters, and why you are doing it and articulating that why is going to matter as well. And ultimately, underneath all of this is really the culture. What are you doing, in either positively or negatively, to your organization's culture? And so for us, this gets wrapped around this idea of joy at work, right? So you can execute the change and do it so that you are doing the things that you want to do to get people back into the office, but do it in a way that actually diminishes joy at work. So diminishes some of the dimensions that you see out to the right. So trust goes down, respect goes down. But you could also do it in a way that increases joy at work. And so this is what we would urge all of you to think about, or any leader, or any change manager to think about, is how do we increase the 10 dimensions of joy at work with any change that we're going to go do, so that we're having an improving cycle to the culture. So we do the change and joy at work increases, and so the team's even more ready for the next change. So we go back to the office and people are happy to be back at the office, and joy at work is increased because we did it in a way that's really useful. And then the next big hard project comes along and people are actually energized to jump into it because they're like, well, if we could do this thing, we could do anything. And you get that sort of positive cycle going as a result of that. So all of that we've wrapped into what is now our new change analytics concentration. So Roxanne and I have been working on redoing all these pieces. We've got those out and we've made a couple pretty big changes to it. So one is we've moved it to be an immediate access. So with all the recorded content and the tools out there, when people sign up and you're in, you have all of that material, all of that's right there for you. Immediately, and you have access to that now forever. So we've turned this into an evergreen setup that we will continue to update. And so as we get smarter, mostly as we get feedback from you guys, we're going to ask what questions you have, and these questions are key for the kind of changes that we make to this thing, to be able to keep updating that. And then in addition to that, we'll do live simulations. So in the live simulation, we won't talk about the concepts. There won't be any lecture-y kind of stuff. We've got an example, and we will spend the entire time going through the example. And once people are in, they can come to as many of those in a year that they would like to, because they'll all end up being a little different, because there'll be different people there and things will go in different directions as a result of that. We designed it to have that kind of flexibility. So we hope that you guys can find some value in that. Would look to check that out so you can catch our website to do that. And this again is wrapped around this idea of joy at work. And in the last 6 weeks or so, Roxanne and I published our first guide to joy at work. We've been doing this research and we actually put it together and have that out the door. And you can find that wherever you get books on Barnes & Noble or Amazon, and download the electronic version of that. We're really proud of being able to take all of this together and get it out the door. I'm just happy to be able to do it. We've been so fortunate to get to interview all these different executives. So here's our information. If you guys want to connect with us any further, and please do so, because we love talking about this stuff. So if you want to send us an email or just put it to our open company email, which is joy@thechangedecision.com, please do that. And then you can catch what we are writing on Medium and on our blog. And we're relatively prolific on that and trying to stay on top of these new ideas that are coming. And with that, I'll say thanks. Glad that you guys were here, and I'm going to take us off of the SlideShare so I can hopefully see your faces, and if you have questions, be able to talk to you about those. So what, if anything, do you guys have? It's like the waiting silence part. What you guys may not know is I have 3 daughters, so I can totally wait out the silence. So as long as you guys want to be quiet, I can be quiet. That's fine. Whatever you guys got.
So Prasad, yes, this recording will be available to rewatch. Absolutely. What we do is post these on our webinar page after every time we do a webinar. So it'll be there.
Yeah, and you guys will get a follow-up email just pointing you to it.
Yeah.
But I mean, you go there directly yourself, and just it's always on the bottom of our webinar page. We have the last 2 that we've done, the last change analytics one and the last change leadership webinar. So the links will always be there for those.
Ed and Roxanne, this is for maybe a slightly different question. There are organizations that are doing exactly what you asked us not to, which is slamming people into the office on a certain day. So hypothetically, if you happen to be part of one of these organizations, maybe what are some of the things to look out for in terms of just behaviors, metrics, just to try to keep an eye on, is that becoming a detractor from building the right culture? Because like it or not, that is unfortunately happening in more than one case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would still, the metrics are probably still similar, Parag, right?
Yeah.
I think the how part is probably increasing the likelihood that you might have a negative impact on some of them. But I would want to pay attention to, how do you know if your business or your division, your team is doing well? So what would be the things that you would look at to understand that, and make sure that you're paying attention to those metrics as you go through the change back. If the company itself is not going to manage the change, doesn't mean that you can't. So
Right.
You can still talk to your folks, whether that's a survey or you do a focus group or do some one-on-one meetings with them, whatever it is, to kind of get that sentiment back. And you can always say that I'm going to try and do whatever I can to make this as good as I can within the constraints that I have.
Right.
But at least you're showing that, which starts to get into the cultural part of this as well. And I think when you start to think about some metrics that are around what is happening in my culture, what do you think about? Or you're asking your people, what do they think about that in terms of the impact to the culture? And that means you have to have some level of a definition of what do you mean by your culture? Like what is important to you? It may be the company values, it may be your personal values. You may have some things that are defined for your own team, and that again could end up just being survey information. So asking the people on your team how they feel about those things. And if that move to the office is coming soon, I might start asking those questions now so that I could track them through the weeks coming into going back to the office and the weeks once everyone is finally back at the office, and try and manage your way through that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
You're making me remember the last webinar that we did was focused on this as well, but it was more about change in leadership. And this is where, I mean, we've been through a lot of situations where the larger company has a decision, and we have responsibility for a team inside the company, and so we actually got them involved in helping us with managing the change. And we asked these 3 questions. So here's the decision. What do you like about it? What do you find challenging about it? And how would you recommend we overcome those challenges? And it's not that they get to change the decision, because that's not true. They don't get to. But they can have a voice in how the change is handled within reason, right? It is a way to empower a team appropriately. Does that make sense?
It does. I especially like the 3rd question, because it takes them away from just complaining about the decision to then being a participant in solving the problem. So very easy to say, I don't like ABC, XYZ, but it's the, okay, what can we do to help you get through this better, or what do you think we can do to help get through this better, as opposed to just change the decision? Because you're right, that is not happening. So let's be clear that it's not happening, but what would you suggest? And we'll take as much of that into consideration. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. And you can get them involved in actually solving it as well, right? That if you find a way to get them to take ownership, then they don't feel like a victim of it, right? I mean, that's the big shift that you want to make.
Guys, just a couple more minutes. If you got anything else, love to talk about whatever else is on your mind.
Hey, Ed and Roxanne, this is Denny. Thanks again. I think this was a great session. I have similar interests as you two do. These are all important questions. There's certainly a lot of examples of some companies being thoughtful about how they are returning to the office, and some are not. And I think there's a lot that could be learned about the pandemic, about an organization's operations and the culture, and because of it, and also bringing them back, as you mentioned. And so the decision is whether or not you want to do it thoughtfully or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity, great opportunity to have a really positive driver on your culture if you do this well. But I'm sure there are a lot of companies that won't feel like they can take the time to do it, or feeling pressed by, and I can certainly understand that, right? This has been immensely difficult economic time for so many people, that people are heads down just trying to make their thing work, and go, okay, we got to get back to the office and try and take this. Okay, it's September 12th, everyone back. That's just the way it is. And you kind of slam it back in that way. And you could see why that would be a likely thing what people would want to do, but it's probably a mistake. So it's likely that you're going to have some trouble with that. And so it would be worthwhile to do it even a little bit to try and guide through how you do this and make sure that you're communicating well with the people on the team in the company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're working with some HR professionals, and they're just overwhelmed. There are just so many factors, right? You're probably experiencing the same thing. So, I feel a lot of empathy for, trying to solve this really challenging problem.
Yeah.
Well, great, everyone. We appreciate you guys taking some time to hang out with us, and thanks for your questions and comments. And we will have this up shortly. Oh, wait a minute. Prasad's got a question. Does your research show that hybrid work culture is going to be the new? Well, I think I don't know that I would call it research, Prasad, because that would probably make that sound more official than it really is. But I would say that companies that we're working with, there are many of them that are explicitly going to pull some sort of a hybrid approach into the future. Now, I don't know that everybody's got it figured out what that's going to mean, but every company, just about every company we're talking to is really thinking about that. There are some firms, of course, where being in the building matters to go do whatever it is that you do. And they've been working through the pandemic. They just have had to go through all these protocols. So they get to get rid of some of those protocols. But for companies that can do that are more completely knowledge worker based, that's what we're hearing. How you're going to do that and what the impact is to your culture as a result of that, and how many moves you're going to have to make over the next year to figure that out, I don't think anybody knows, but I have to assume that there's going to be a lot in there. There's no way we're going to show up and get it all right the first time. So we're going to need to remain flexible and think our way through how do we react to the changes and keep trying to make the improvements.
Yeah, and I would say, we all know hybrid was there before, right? I mean, we weren't all together physically before. I mean, it's a kind of hybrid, right? So there are things that we can take from that and apply it here. It's not that all that learning goes away. It's relevant now. So it's not, I mean, it seems like it's unfamiliar, but it's really not that unfamiliar if you think about all of the kinds of hybrid interactions we've had historically at work.
Well, everyone, good luck with your upcoming changes, and please reach out if you got any thoughts. Roxanne and I are always open for a coffee chat Zoom. If you guys want to talk about what's going on, we love this stuff, and anything we can do to help you have it land better, we would love to do. All right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
For more information on the change analytics concentration, go to www.thechangedecision.com and then press on the courses button at the top.